What is the unique role the U.S. Army has taken in Japan? What are the differences in how the United States Army and the Japanese self-defense forces approach history? How can a foreign perspective inform American decision-making? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the unique aspects and differences of the role of military history within the U.S. Army and the Japanese self-defense forces. Joining me for this discussion is Shannon Granville, an editor with the Center of Military History who recently completed a one-year program in Japan. Thank you, Shannon, for being here.
I'm happy to be here, Lee, and I'm glad to be back at CMH.
Welcome back. And I know we'll get into some of what took place in that exciting year that you spent in Japan recently. But before we do that, let me introduce you to the audience. So Shannon Granville is the senior editor in the Multimedia and Publications Division at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. Previously, she was editor and deputy publications director with the Woodrow Wilson Center Press, where her responsibilities included editing manuscripts for the Cold War International History Project. She has a master's degree in international history from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's degree in history from the College of William and Mary. Her research interests include Cold War history, post-war British and Japanese politics, and political satire and popular culture. That sounds fun. And as a member of the 26th class of Mansfield Fellows in 2022-2023, she spent a year working with the Japanese government on topics related to military history. All right, Shannon, it's great. Fascinating background there. And you seem focused a lot on international history or military history.
Yes, very much.
And spent time in England. Now you've spent time in Japan. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion for these foreign perspectives here. So let's talk about the U.S. Army's unique history in Japan and the way that we both approach history. But tell me about this opportunity that you had, because I think this is going to really help set up the rest of the discussion. Tell us about your year in Japan.
So yes, I was a member of the Mansfield Fellowship Program, which is a program run by the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation, named after Ambassador Mike Mansfield, who was the former I believe, longest-serving ambassador to Japan and the former Democratic senator from Montana. The fellowship was established in 1994, and I was a member of the 26th class with 9 other federal government employees, which included 2 active-duty Air Force fellows. So as part of the fellowship program, federal government employees from the executive, legislative, and judicial branch, as well as active-duty service members, are able to have intensive Japanese language training and go to Japan for a year to work with our Japanese government counterparts in specific agencies. So as my fellowship focus was on U.S. and Japanese military history and history in general, my placements included time at the Ministry of Defense, including the direct CMH counterpart, the National Institute for Defense Studies. Cool. Yes. I also spent time at the National Archives of Japan and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Diplomatic Archives, both of which have some absolutely incredible materials, not only about Japanese history, but about the U.S.-Japan relationship. And as part of my time with the Ministry of Defense, I was able to spend 3 weeks with the National Defense Academy, the service academy for the Japanese self-defense forces located south of Yokosuka. And during my time with the Defense Academy, I was able to have a truly once-in-a-lifetime experience of going with the Defense Academy cadets for 2 days to the island of Iwo Jima on a staff ride on an Iwo Jima.
I'm jealous.
This is a common. All the other fellows were very jealous too.
Oh, you were the only one.
I was the only fellow to go on this.
Were you the only American on that?
I was,
tour?
yes.
Oh,
I was the only American on this trip. I think the only civilian on the trip as well. Everyone else was either a instructor from the Defense Academy or one of the cadets. I also had the very good fortune to be able to go for a week to Okinawa to spend some time at the Okinawa Prefectural Archives, which have an absolutely fantastic collection of materials on U.S. Army history in post-war Japan.
Now, I'm sure you learned a lot in that whole year that you were there. But what about what you offered? Was there anything that were the Japanese excited to have you there? And learn from you also?
Yes, they were very excited to have me there. They were so interested in the materials that we have and the way that the U.S. Army teaches history. I actually gave several presentations in both English and in Japanese about CMH's Lincoln Assassination Staff Ride, which they were truly fascinated by. Not just the fact that it was this very well-organized staff ride, but the fact that it was not about an actual battle or campaign. So I subtly or not so subtly said, yes, this is the sort of structure for a staff ride that you can do that focuses on, if you don't want to talk specifically about battles, you can use this for other aspects of military history as well. Yeah,
we call our non-traditional staff rides, and there's so much that the military can learn from these things. But I don't want to get too far off topic here. We're going to discuss your time in Iwo Jima in a few minutes. But first tell me, what are the differences then between American, the U.S., and Japanese military history? You know, the different approaches to that.
So the one thing that I noticed very quickly is that, especially working at CMH, we tend to see U.S. military history and often U.S. Army history in general as a continuum. There's all of this focus on since 1775 and the long tradition of the Army and our lineage and honors and all of this information that really focuses on the continuity and the heritage of the U.S. Army. In contrast, Japanese military history has an absolute break in 1945.
Oh, wow.
It is treated as everything is pre-war, senzen in Japanese, or post-war, sengo. And that break is noticeable not just in how history is taught, but even in how the Japanese refer to their defense structure. The Japanese self-defense forces do not use the term army or military or soldier.
Wow.
I learned that very quickly when I was over there because because they corrected me. They said, do not refer to self-defense force members as soldiers because we are not soldiers. This is specifically because the self-defense forces are not seen as a replacement for the Imperial Japanese Army, but they serve a completely different purpose. And this thinking was actually encouraged by the United States as part of the post-war demilitarization process.
Right. So if they don't refer to the Japanese Defense Forces as soldiers or sailors, what do they refer to them as?
I usually heard the word self-defense force member. Self-defense forces in Japanese being jietai, we would use the word jietain or self-defense force member. Officers are still referred to as officers, but generally speaking, self-defense force member was the safest expression for me to use, especially as somebody who is conversant in Japanese, but I would certainly not call myself fully fluent.
Especially when it comes to World War II. When we study World War II, we're looking at the battles, the tactics, the strategies, the leaders. Do the Japanese do the same thing?
They do, and there is some discussion, certainly when looking at World War II, the focus on individual campaigns. When I was at the equivalent of the Command and General Staff College, I spent about 2 weeks there studying how sort of senior leadership learns about battles. There was great focus on Japanese campaigns in Burma. And also sort of looking at both the Army's campaign in the China-Burma-India theater and also then looking at different perspectives on battles in the Pacific Ocean area. And so there is focus on that, but I think that it is still looked at almost as if you are teaching the history of another country. It's a different country's, there's a sense of distance there that I think that the United States does not have in quite the same way.
And I think you've mentioned to me before something that really jumps out is that Japan doesn't talk about the war, and the United States doesn't talk about the peace. Can you explain that?
This was one of the conclusions that I had during my time in Japan is, and I use this as the sort of single sentence summary of what I learned over there, is that Japan doesn't talk about the war, but the United States doesn't talk about the peace. Now, Japan does talk about the war, certainly. It's not erased from Japanese history. However, the focus of the history is so often on the suffering of people, the devastation, the loss of life, the fact that war is terrible, that it's tragic. There's a museum in Tokyo, a very small museum called the Shokeikan, and it is a museum specifically dedicated to the experience of sick and wounded soldiers, with some of the most absolutely visceral dioramas I've ever seen, one showing a life-size depiction of a man having his arm amputated without anesthetic in a cave somewhere in the Pacific Islands. Wow. And you were encouraged to look at this from the perspective of, this is agony, war is hell. And so, the view of war is hardship, suffering, but there's very little discussion of what Japan was actually doing in Korea, in Manchuria, in China, in Burma, in the Pacific Islands. So in that perspective, Japan does not talk about the war specifically, the conduct of the war. Now, in contrast, certainly CMH through the Green Books and other things, the U.S. is very focused on the war, on the campaigns, the personalities, the tactics, the logistics. But once the Japanese surrender in 1945, military history's focus shifts very quickly to Korea. And the discussion of the occupation, of the legacy of Douglas MacArthur, the fact that the Army ran Okinawa until 1972, we don't focus on that at all. And that is a very strong focus in Japanese history. And
you mentioned Douglas MacArthur. What's their view of him?
He is a larger-than-life figure. One of the most famous photographs, I saw it in so many Japanese history textbooks. There's a photograph taken of MacArthur standing next to Emperor Hirohito, the Showa emperor. So Hirohito is wearing full formal dress of the time period, standing very stiffly, and MacArthur is standing next to him with his hands in his pockets. And just that one photograph says so much about MacArthur and about how it's a photograph that symbolizes defeat, but it also symbolizes the transition from the wartime period to the post-war period.
Now, another question for you is: I spent some time in China, and when we're talking about history, they refer to the Chinese. They refer to World War II as the war against the Japanese. The Korean War they called the war against America.
Yes.
How does Japan refer to the Second World War?
So this is a very interesting aspect that I was careful to focus on when I was over there, because during the war itself, from everything that I have read, the accepted phrase for the war was usually Daitowa Senso, or the Great East Asia War. After the war, the United States specifically said, no, we are going to change that. We are changing it to Taiheiyo Senso, or the Pacific War, which, when you think about it, completely reframes the structure of the conflict. So I will often, this has since changed in the intervening years. So sometimes you will see Asia Taiheiyo Senso, or the Asia Pacific War. Sometimes you'll see the something more like the 15 Years' War if you are trying to have a much broader aspect of the conflict. But more often than not, these days, I will usually just see it referred to as Dainiji Sekai Taisen, the Second World War, as we would say it.
So they will refer to it as the Second World War.
They do, yes.
Time. Okay.
Yes.
Again, one of those interesting perspectives, looking at a conflict like that from a different country. All right, so let's move on and describe a little bit more the differences in how the United States looks at history compared to how the Japanese look at it.
One thing that I often had to explain to my Japanese counterparts when we talked about history education, I also spent some time at the Ministry of Education in the Curriculum Development Department and with the Agency for Cultural Affairs, which is responsible for the management and preservation of many true historical artifacts in Japan, is that Japan has a nationwide structured history curriculum that runs through the equivalent of ninth grade in the United States. Whereas in the United States, history curriculum is so very state dependent, and it can vary based on state, from state to state, which is why U.S. history textbooks often have different editions depending on what part of the country they're from. So it is easy I think, for Japanese history textbooks to be very focused on this one curriculum, and everyone who comes into, say, the National Defense Academy, there's an understanding that everyone will have studied the same parts of history over time. Whereas I think sometimes when we talk at CMH about teaching history, you often have to feel as if you need to re-explain certain aspects of history that people might not have covered or might not have received the same amount of emphasis. If you live in California studying the American Revolution, or if you live in Maine studying the Indian Wars in the 19th century. So, but in general, history is extremely popular in Japan. I would say that, but it's so often pre-1800s history, the samurai dramas, especially as part of local history, including full-on reenactments in samurai armor. And this includes, not necessarily specialists in history, but people who have a deep and genuine interest in local history. I was once in a taxi cab in Ishikawa Prefecture, near the city of Kanazawa, and when I mentioned that I was interested in history to the taxi driver, the entire taxi ride of 20 minutes, he gave me a full and complete history of local Ishikawa Prefecture history from the days of the Maeda clan all the way through to sort of the different, wars and different time periods. And this is all in Japanese. And so I am hanging on for dear life and doing my best to understand and make oh, yes, I understand. Oh, that's really fascinating, because it was.
Right.
And it was so impressive.
And your language skills were what at the time?
It was definitely a challenge, because he's using very specialized and in some cases archaic vocabulary. So, but thankfully, I had studied enough of the history so that once I started hearing the specific names of people that he was mentioning, I was like, oh, okay, this is the time period he's talking about. So I was able to give what I hoped were semi-coherent responses. But I think he was just thrilled to have a foreigner who would listen to him. It did feel very much like listening to, your grandfather or someone giving you a talk about the local history that he's a huge fan of and you might not know quite so much about.
I want to get back to this staff ride, battlefield staff ride that you did in Iwo Jima. I mean, it's really sounds fascinating. So what was it like experiencing that staff ride from the Japanese perspective, and what can we learn? We, as United States military, what can we learn from that perspective?
The overwhelming sense that I got from the Iwo Jima staff ride was, how do you teach a no-win scenario? Because for the Japanese, the Battle of Iwo Jima was not about victory. It wasn't even about...
So they never expected to win that battle?
No. The purpose of remaining on the island of Iwo Jima was to buy time for further fortifications of the Ryukyu Islands, of the Japanese mainland. And the soldiers on the island knew this. The General Kurebayashi, who was the commander, they knew this. This was not going to be a victory. The purpose was to hold out as long as possible, to make American casualty as high as possible, to do whatever they could. But how do you teach a no-win scenario? I can't think of any battle in U.S. history where we would teach this idea of the point is not to survive, the point is not to win, the point is just to... Well,
oftentimes we'll have a delaying action.
Right, yes.
But we can get away. There they knew it was fight and die, basically.
And in when you think about it, in the context of a self-defense force, this mindset actually makes some degree of sense, because again, the idea of holding a line in a purely defensive action, I think, is something that the self-defense forces, especially for young cadets who may not have actually experienced this idea of being on a former battlefield, it's something that I remember just seeing and talking with them a little bit during my time there. you could tell that it had an effect on them. You could tell that that walking the grounds and understanding so many people had died here. One of the things that we had to do was there's no potable water on Iwo Jima. There's no good natural water source there. So all of us brought bottles of water to the island. And in many cases, whenever we visited a site, a former gun emplacement, we were encouraged to pour water as offerings to the deceased on the island because the Japanese regard it as a mass grave.
The whole island?
The whole island is a mass grave. There are a number of memorials there, and while the cadets were touring parts of the island through the more actual campaign-focused aspects of the staff ride, I went with some of the instructors to visit some of the memorials to provide offerings of water and of incense.
Now, are there cemeteries there too?
Mostly memorial sites. There are I think part of it is just the fact that the island is so volcanically unstable. It's part of a volcanic island chain that burials are very difficult. And also there is a considerable amount of unexploded ordnance still on the island. So it is not necessarily considered safe to go walking around there on your own.
When I've toured northern France, let's say, for seeing some of the World War I sites and the World War II sites, there in France, there's German cemeteries, there's French, British, American. So in Iwo Jima, do they have memorials for the Japanese and the Americans there?
They do, and in fact, there are a few memorials that are joint U.S.-Japanese memorials where they say these are memorials where the survivors from the battle came back to the island and commemorated the fact that that there's peace between our two countries, that we are now partners. Where we once were enemies, we are now friends. And that was also, again, a very sobering experience. But mentioning the sort of World War I and the kind of, carnage that you can still feel even decades, a century later, one of the aspects of the staff ride is that we were able to go into part of the tunnel system that runs under the island. Again, these natural volcanic caves that were hollowed out by the Japanese defenders. And so I'm 5'10" tall. It was a very tight squeeze for me to go down on my hands and knees and crawl into one of these caves. But inside the cave with a group of cadets, we were all told to turn off our headlamps. And one of the instructors from the Defense Academy read the final message of the Japanese commander, General Kurebayashi, to Imperial Japanese Army headquarters, essentially apologizing for the fact that he couldn't do more, but at the same time, subtly or not so subtly, condemning the fact that he and his men had been left there to die. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I'm standing in the pitch black crying because it was just such a deeply visceral experience to feel the weight of history in a way that I don't think I'd ever really felt before.
Yeah, and was there any sense during this staff ride of what the Japanese defenders felt or thought? Are there any survivors or letters or diaries that were referred to as part of this?
Well, certainly General Kurebayashi's letter is a central point for understanding the perspective on the conflict. Certainly presenting this idea of, the defenders fought, we were loyal to the empire, we were loyal to the emperor, and we will give up our lives to defend our island, to protect our people and our homeland. And at the same time, certainly studying the maps of the conflict, and that was something that also, shook me quite deeply, was to look at the maps for the staff ride and to see the U.S. forces presented in enemy red. Not something that I had really thought about very deeply until I saw that. But now that I've seen it, I think that every soldier should see what it looks like to see your own forces depicted as the enemy on a map.
What would you say are the differences, if any, in how the Japanese approach a staff ride compared to how we do here in the U.S. Army?
So for staff rides, Iwo Jima is certainly very unique because there are not very many battlefield sites in Japan that can be treated in the same way with the staff ride. Iwo Jima is probably one of the best preserved. Certainly in places like Okinawa, I spoke to some self-defense force officers. I spoke to one who had actually created his own sort of small Battle of Okinawa staff ride that he used as an instructor. But there is a deep reluctance to make sort of a big project presentation out of it, because there's still this reluctance to even talk about the history of a conflict that you've lost. And not in the sense of shame, but in the sense of, well, there's no real lessons that we can learn from this. Why would we want to study this history of failure? Which in some respects, reminds me of some of the, the difficulty in studying a battle of failure, a battle that you lost, a battle where you were forced to retreat. And it takes a very different perspective than sort of teaching the, yes, and here is how we achieved victory, much less so in the, yes, here's how we did not manage to achieve our goals.
Yeah, was there a focus on, the strategy going into it, the tactics that took place, the lessons learned? These are all things that we cover in our staff rides here. Yes. Did they do that at Iwo Jima?
They did, yes. There was a focus on sort of decision-making and the use of the terrain, especially the aspect of this natural tunnel system that I think, really made an important contribution to how long the Japanese were able to hold out. But again, tempered with this aspect of the strategy and tactics, there is still this message of the suffering. One of the caves that I went to with the instructors, they said, yes, this was used as a hospital area, staging area for the wounded. And one of them pulled me aside and pointed up to a small air hole in the ceiling and said, "Oh, yes, do you see this?" And I said, yes, I can see this very well. And they said, this was one of the holes in which the Americans poured gasoline and then used flamethrowers to mop in a mopping up operation to sort of burn the defenders out of the cave. And it's very hard to know how to respond to that apart from, yes, I understand. No one ever made me feel guilty or bad. There's no sense of that. The guilt has not carried over into generations, but it is still a perspective that you have to sit with it when you walk away.
And what would you say was the purpose of that focus on the suffering? What was the big lesson learned from that for them?
I think it is to focus on the fact that Japan, in its constitution, encouraged by the United States, written by the United States, is that we've renounced war as a tool of national policy. War in this context is something to be avoided. And it is something that it really focuses on the human cost of war for the civilians and for those who have to fight as well.
So now let's talk a little bit about these different perspectives and how these foreign perspectives and how we can use them in the U.S. military.
So I absolutely think that looking at the military history of other countries from their own point of view is an invaluable experience. I believe young soldiers should be strongly encouraged to learn a foreign language, to work with our allies, to go on military exchanges, to visit places like Verdun, to visit cemeteries, to understand the terrain of fighting in a foreign country, and to sort of see it from the perspective, again, to think about what does it mean to be the enemy in a foreign context like this, to sort of seek out opportunities to make these international connections, which I believe deepen your understanding of military history. I talked with U.S. and other country service members who were taking part in classes at the National Defense Academy and at the Senior Staff College, and they said that the experience of being in Japan was a real leadership learning experience for them because it really forced them to re-examine their own perspectives and to learn about how the Japanese defense community understands the world.
Yeah, and I think those cultural aspects, when you say that the Japanese knew that we're going to stand and we're going to fight to the death, understanding that, I think forces the other side, the Americans, to take a different approach. And you see that like today with the most recent wars, global war on terror, where you had a lot of the Al-Qaeda or the insurgents that were taking that same, that same perspective.
I will also say that sometimes it's one of the things that really fascinated me was the fact that the Japanese self-defense forces really teach aspects of U.S. battle history, campaign history that I had never thought about before. There was a deep focus on the Persian Gulf War when I was over there and the teaching of the 1991 Gulf War. Right. And as someone who remembers it, grew up during that time period, and I will admit to some extent I've kind of conflated the 1991 Gulf War with the 2003 Iraq War.
And a lot of people do that.
And a lot of people do that. But to see it from the Japanese perspective, because they were looking at it from the perspective of this is a defensive action of pushing an invading force out of a small territory. It's absolutely applicable to the Japanese experience. And so for them, again, with the presence of U.S. forces, and so for them, they are looking at this as this is a joint operation. We want to understand the operability aspects and to see how an invading army could be repulsed from a country.
Right.
They were also, when I was there, extremely focused on teaching the invasion of Ukraine. Every day at the Defense Academy, when I was sitting in the classes, the instructors would say, here's the current front line, here's changes that have happened in the last 24, 48 hours, and encourage the students to really think about this aspect of, again, this is an invasion, and this is how a smaller military force is repelling a larger force. Right. Again, a very topical, topical and applicable experience for the Japanese.
Yeah, I mean, it all gets back to perspective, right? What is their mission?
Yes.
It's very different from the mission of the U.S. military. Theirs is defense, and it's right there in their name, Japanese Self-Defense Forces. So I can see, why that would be important to understand that. And who do they view as their biggest threats? If they think they have to repulse somebody, who do they look at?
So it is still very much a case of China, North Korea, and Russia are the biggest threats. When I was over there, and when I was actually in Okinawa, I had the fascinating experience of being woken up at 6 a.m. by J Alert, by the country's emergency warning system, saying that the North Koreans had launched a missile, take shelter immediately. And I didn't quite know what to do with that information as I was in a hotel in Naha at 6 a.m. And so, unfortunately, I didn't hear.
This was not this is not a test.
This is not a test. Yeah. This is 100%. This missile has been fired. We are tracking it now. And I didn't hear fighter jets scrambling or anything like that around from the different bases on Okinawa. So I thought, okay, this might be just another a test launch. And in fact, it was, but. That's still not a way that you want to wake up in the morning. But this is a fact of life in Japan, is that these emergency alerts can happen, and North Korean missiles are very real, a very real threat.
Well, this has been fascinating so far. Are there other points that we didn't cover that you want to address?
So one thing that I do specifically want to address is this idea of remembering the Army's presence in Japan. I think that in this day and age, there's a tendency for the Army to look at Japan, and in particular...
You're talking about the U.S. Army.
The U.S. Army, yes. For the U.S. Army to look at Japan, and in particular Okinawa, and say, yes, well, Japan, that's the Navy's sphere, that's the Air Force's sphere, that's the Marine Corps sphere. The Army's in Korea, the Army's in Guam, but we're not in Japan. When in reality, you can't understand post-war Japanese history, specifically, and certainly not post-war Japanese defense history, without understanding the Army's role in Okinawa and the fact that the High Commissioner of the Ryukyu Islands was, for many years, the top U.S. official. That's Army history. And so I'm hoping to use some of the materials that I was able to collect during my fellowship year to help fill in the gaps in the Army's historical memory regarding Japan. So I hope to be able to write some articles or do some other research.
So the Army basically left, because I don't think we have any Army bases or posts there, do we?
We do. We have, there's Camp Zama, which is a comparatively small installation. It's about an hour and a half outside of Tokyo. There are some smaller Army, sort of scattered Army units. There's a few in Okinawa, but for the most part, the Army built the facilities, and now the Navy and the Air Force own them. So it's and the Marine Corps.
Marines, of course, yeah.
And so, but the Army's presence is everywhere in Japan. In Okinawa in particular, I noticed it very strongly, even down to the food culture. If you've ever, anyone who's been to Okinawa may very well have had taco rice, which is the Japanese attempt to create a taco dish palatable to the Americans and also to Japanese palates as well. It's pretty good, but it's a very unique piece of U.S. service culture in Okinawa.
Well, also baseball.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I
Big
believe.
influence there from the Army.
I
Yeah.
believe, in fact, we're coming up on one of the major. I can't remember. Is it 150 years of baseball's presence in Japan?
All right, well, great. This has been really, really fascinating. It's great to see a different perspective and just to hear about the Iwo Jima,
Yes.
the staff ride, how they look at staff rides and study history. But before we close, it's time for our segment called Hua Trivia. So this is a piece of significant Army trivia that you can share about your experiences in Japan relating to Army history. So what do you have for us?
If you're ever in Tokyo and you want to see one of the key buildings that General Douglas MacArthur and the GHQ used during the occupation of Japan, there's one that's very close to Tokyo Station, maybe only about 3 or 4 minutes walk away. It's called the Meiji Life Insurance Building, or Meiji Seimeikan, and it's a beautiful example of 1930s Greek Revival architecture, and it's been listed as one of Japan's national important cultural properties. And a section of the building is open for public tours with the original decor and period furniture and informational displays that actually includes a number of photographs from MacArthur's time, from the time of GHQ. It's not exactly a well-known tourist spot, but it's a fine piece of historic preservation with a real connection to U.S. Army history.
Oh, great. Well, good. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences here. This has been fascinating, and appreciate all your insights, Shannon. So thank you for your lessons learned from your experiences in Japan as it relates to Army history. And if anyone wants to learn more about the history of the U.S. Army in Japan, or learn more about Army history in general, I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.